Fountainhead Forum 10. I have Richard Ebeling, former president of the Foundation for Economic Education, longtime professor of economics and a dedicated professor in the Austrian School of Economics, as well as he's been heavily involved with the Future of Freedom Foundation with Jacob Hornberger. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on. It's a great pleasure.
Yeah, it's great to have you on too, to get somebody of your stature here. It's going to be a good launch. So I wanted to really to ask, you've got so much to tell, but there's this picture of you in which you are standing in, which you have on your Facebook, in which you're standing in Lithuania, and I believe it's in Lithuania, in front of a tank, and you have this. You're standing in front of the tank, and this is from 1991.
January 1991, correct.
January 1991, and it's it's definitely a memorable shot. You can see the snow, and so first of all, what took you over there, and what happened during all this time? Because you saw all of this fall apart.
Well, at the time, I was a professor of economics at Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan. I was holding a chair, the Ludwig von Mises Chair in economics. And I and a colleague who has since passed away, but was a professor of political science at Hillsdale, and who was originally from Lithuania, he and I had started traveling to the former Soviet Union as a team, offering consulting advice on market reform and privatization. It was the last years of the Soviet Union, 1991. Maybe some of the listeners remember a little bit of that time. In 1986, one of the series of aged Soviet leaders passed away, and a new head of the Soviet Communist Party was appointed, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was a devoted socialist, but he wanted this idea of socialism with a human face, and the idea of a variety of political and economic reforms to make the Soviet stodgy central planning system somehow workable and recoverable. So he started allowing small private enterprises and joint ventures between Soviet state enterprises and Western private companies. Now, in the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, had been independent countries between the two world wars. But as part of the secret pact that Hitler and Stalin had signed in 1939, literally just a week or so before the start of the Second World War in Europe, they had made an agreement that if war broke out, they would divide Poland among each other, which they did, and that the three Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, would be annexed by the Soviet Union, and the Nazis would accept that as part of the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. So they lost their freedom, and but they wanted their national independence back, and they were aggressively pushing for this. And so, since my colleague, his name was Alexander Stromas, had originally been from Lithuania and had contacts over there, we started going over there on preparing plans for, he as a political scientist, how to write a democratic and limited government constitution. And I was preparing proposals on how to privatize state farms, how to transfer state industries into competitive private hands. What do you do with residential apartment buildings that perhaps before the Soviet period had been privately owned, but the state had taken them over? Now generations of people had been living there, assigned to those apartments by the state. And what if there was some still living relative of the original owner from before the First World War? Well, is there no restitution to return stolen and looted and plundered and nationalized property to the original owners? That applied to land, obviously. What do you do with collective farms that had originally been private farms? But I was preparing a whole variety of such proposals for the day when they would be independent, be able to move from socialism to some market economy. And on one of these trips in January of 1991, the Soviet government, which was headed by Gorbachev, decided that they were going to crack down on this national freedom movement. And in one night, they sent in the tanks and the troops, and they killed 13 people, three of them run over by tanks. And being younger and therefore more foolish, I suppose, I was out on the streets with my Lithuanian friends facing these Soviet forces. First at the Lithuanian radio station in the capital, Vilnius radio station. And the Soviet forces started approaching this crowd. And the crowd kept chanting Lietuva, 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 which is just Lithuania, Lithuania, Lithuania. And when the crowd refused to disperse, a Soviet officer barked a command, and the soldiers started moving forward and beating people up and shooting. And so I was caught in the middle of this with bullets whizzing by. And a Soviet soldier was about to smash me in the face with the butt of his rifle until a Lithuanian friend of mine jumped in front of it and took the blow on his arm. But they succeeded in driving everyone away from the radio station. And then a group of us proceeded to join another group that was already at the television tower, and which the Soviets obviously grabbed. They had tanks and soldiers as well. But the photograph that you're referring to, which is a photo on my Facebook page, is just immediately after the Soviets had succeeded in taking over the radio tower, and that's with me and some other Lithuanians confronting them. And that's a Soviet tank in the background of that picture, immediately behind me, with a Soviet tank officer with his head poking out of one of the turrets. And there it is. And that was, like I said, in January 1991. Then we were also doing consulting work with the Russian parliament and the Moscow city government. And to make a rather long story short, I was on one of these other trips to Moscow in August of 91, when a group of hardliners in the Soviet Communist Party decided to attempt a coup d'etat to overthrow Gorbachev and to bring back the worst features of the old system. And they kidnapped Gorbachev. He was being held in the Crimea, where he was on holiday. They attempted to interdict Boris Yeltsin, who was the president of the Russian Soviet Federation, but he eluded them. He reached the Russian Parliament building, pretty much in the center of Moscow, stood atop a tank of a unit that refused to go along with the coup leaders, appealing to the people of Moscow to rally around him to fight for what was the hope for a budding democracy, for a free Russia. And my future wife, my wife is Russian. I met her in Moscow. My future wife and I were in that crowd, and that went on for 3 days, from August 19th to the 21st. And we stood there with crowds confronted by Soviet tanks and KGB units, and several people died in that episode. But finally, the coup failed for a variety of reasons, luckily. And then the day after the coup failed, they had a big rally in a plaza behind this parliament building to celebrate the failure of it. And Boris Yeltsin spoke, Elena Bonner, the widow of the famous Soviet physicist and dissident Andrei Sakharov, and others. And in this ocean of Russians that I was standing in, suddenly all the eyes went up to the top of the building, to the flagpole. And being lowered was the Soviet flag, the red Soviet flag with the yellow hammer and sickle in the upper left-hand corner. And in its place were being raised the pre-revolutionary old traditional Russian colors, which are their own version of red, white, and blue. And suddenly, from this literally massive ocean of Russians, tens of thousands of Russians, came this chant: "Svoboda, Svoboda, Svoboda, freedom, freedom, freedom." And so, after 75 years of Soviet tyranny, those people were now shouting freedom with the hope that they could finally become an open and free and what they called a normal society, like in the West. Obviously, things have not turned out that way with Vladimir Putin and all that's going on domestically, and now this war in Ukraine. But at that moment, in August of 1991, for tens of thousands of Muscovites, that was the chant for freedom with the hope of a better future. And so that's what took me there. And it was an absolutely fascinating moment, because you aren't often in the middle of watching a turning point in history, and certainly the end of the Soviet Union, or the events leading formally to the end of the Soviet Union, is something unique in a person's lifetime.
What percentage of Lithuanians had a memory of pre-World War II Lithuania?
That is a very good question. Now, of course, for Russians, it was different.
Yeah.
They lived under an absolute monarchy, the Tsars, up until 1917.
Yes.
Then Lenin and the Bolsheviks took over in their military coup d'etat of November 1917. And after fighting a rather bloody 2.5, 3 year civil war against the anti-Red forces, he triumphed. And so there was virtually no one in Russia who had a living memory of a world before communism.
Yeah.
Some, obviously, after 75 years, had died just of natural causes. Tens of millions of others had been killed by the system, certainly by Stalin, while he was a tyrant. In the case of Lithuania, or the other Eastern European countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Yugoslavia, or the eastern part of Germany that had been East Germany, they and the Baltic republics, there were people very much alive at the beginning of the 1990s who had a living memory of a world before communism. So you had either grandparents or parents of young people who could tell their children or grandchildren their living memories of, maybe far from being really open democratic societies in those pre-World War II years, but degrees of rule of law, certainly the institution and degrees of respect for private property, maybe certainly not a free market, but degrees of market competition and commercial society, degrees of respect for civil liberties. And that could be passed on to the next generations from people who had lived through that earlier period.
Yeah.
And so there was an optimism, a confidence, an idea of going to a better future from a past that may have been imperfect, but was far greater and better than anything they had had under communism. I traveled through Eastern Europe at that time. I mean, there was a buoyancy, a positiveness, a bright looking to the future by Poles and Czechs and Hungarians and Lithuanians and Latvians and Estonians, for instance. Russians, they had a dream of not having to worry about a knock on the door in the middle of the night, and not having to wait on long lines for dismal types of goods and food. But it was then, and is obviously still hard for them to shake off, centuries of heavy-handed and absolutist paternalism that makes them want to have degrees of freedom, but are willing to concede and accept with the degrees of fatalism the direction and control of a czar. Obviously, you'd prefer to be living under the good czar than the cruel and bad czar, but there's an acquiescence and lack of a spirit of the Western Enlightenment and the idea of rationalism and reason and individual rights and tolerance. There's a lack of that makes it difficult for Russia to escape from its past.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Russia has never had that. I mean, you could go back to Ivan the Terrible, or, I mean, really, it's
Right.
never really been a good situation there.
Right.
Yeah, and I suppose what happened in Lithuania was probably somewhat similar to Latvia and Estonia.
Oh, yes. Yeah, they too had demonstrations. The hardest crackdown was against the Lithuanians in that part of 1991. But the Latvians and the Estonians, they also wanted the independence that Stalin had taken away in 1940. And that is why they were so adamant. There's a lot of arguments about classical liberals and libertarians. Should the United States be involved in active foreign interventions? Should the U.S. be in alliances with other countries? Which are legitimate debates within the classical liberal and libertarian arena. But just talking about them, the Estonians and the Latvians and Lithuanians were hungry once they had their independence to become part of the European Union, to be part of a wider market arena, and be integrated into it. And they were desperate to join NATO because for them, NATO meant protection from any attempt of the post-Soviet Russian government from attempting to take away their freedom again.
Yes, and of course the current president of the Foundation for Economic Education is from Lithuania. Also,
Yeah.
as my recent Polish guest corrected me, she said, "I'm not from Eastern Europe. I'm from Central Europe."
Well, the thing is that if you look at a map of Europe, from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains, and you would see, well, where is the middle of the map?
Yeah,
it basically is Poland and Lithuania.
True. Yeah, I mean, and really, does anybody know where the boundary between Europe and Asia is? But that's another discussion. Certainly, did you ever expect that we would still be fighting the Marxists 30 years later?
That's an interesting question too. Many people, and I would include myself with wishful moments, felt that with the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, the integration of those, what used to be called the captive nations behind the Iron Curtain, into the Western orbit again of America and Western Europe, that this would represent a permanent change of the intellectual climate. I mean, it was so clear that even with us in America being very far from a truly free market, our degree of economic free enterprise and economic liberty had proven to be so superior to any form of socialist central planning that it's sort of like the battle's been fought, the victor has stood the course, and socialism is dead. But here in the United States, what happened is that the leftists, having already become disillusioned with the Soviet Union per se for quite a long time, the more radical ones, still worships Chairman Mao or Fidel Castro, or Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua and that type of thing. But they basically had to accept the fact that the idea of socialism in practice had been made a dismal failure with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. But rather than accept that, they went back to their positions in the ivory tower of American academia to lick their wounds and redesign and recreate and establish a new version of the old wine, that is the old wine in a new bottle. And what this form has basically taken is what we see with what they call wokeism. What we now see here is Marxo-Nazism. Marx, and in fact, not long ago, I wrote an article with that title, that identity politics and critical race theory is just a new form of Marxo-Nazism. They accept implicitly and often explicitly, they implicitly accept the Marxist framework. There is an inescapable class war between those who are the elite owning property and the oppressed who are exploited by the property owners. But the twist on them is that what the identifying characteristic of the exploited and the exploiter through the institution of private property is race. It has been the white race. It has been the white race, and those who are the elite in the white race who use this characteristic to oppress all peoples of color. And this conflict is inescapable and irreconcilable. Just as it was either the capitalists versus the workers, and only one or the other could triumph. But of course, Marx had this idea of dialectical determinism, where history follows a course and the triumph of socialism and the workers over the capitalists is inevitable. What they now said, no, the identifying characteristic of the exploiting class with the institution of private property is race. You are your race. You're either white or you're black or you're brown or you're Asian or you are, and you cannot escape from that. And that all of history is a battle of one race through the institution of private property, attempting to exploit all others. So on the one hand, it's Marxian class analysis, but superimposed over it is that what is the defining characteristics of the opposing groups? And it's race. And you cannot escape from this. It's in the blood, as the Nazis would say. It's in the blood, and you're either white or you're a person of color, and either one is triumphant over the other, or the battle just continues. And you're to be classified, and your status in society, and your economic position, and your privileges and lack of privileges are all to be defined by your race. Now, I should say that this itself was in a form of an outgrowth of what the Soviet Union had. In the 1920s, the Soviets introduced an internal passport, not just the external passport like we get, to travel around to other countries, but an internal passport. This was your papers, your identification papers. And there was line 1, which was your name, and there was line 2, of your date of birth and place of birth, and there was a line 4 with your parents' name, and then there was line 5, and line 5 was your nationality. Were you Russian? Were you Ukrainian? Were you Kazakh? Were you Uzbeki? Were you Armenian? Were you Jewish? And along with your class position, were you a child? Obviously after decades, were you a child of the exploiting class, of the workers, of the intellectuals? And they had a system of affirmative action that determined your opportunities to go to college and what kind of education you could get. That determined what type of employments and positions you could hope to land and move up a pecking order. So basically, you had all of what we have today, ethnic and religious and race-based affirmative action, where your collective classification determined your fate, both opportunities and lack of opportunities. And what now critical race theory and identity politics does is highlight and exaggerate and make central that element of the old Soviet system, and make it the defining characteristic of what class and Marxian conflict is all about. And this is dangerous. It submerges the individual within a tribal identification from which there is no escape. You could learn a different language. You can learn different cultural habits and traits and ways of living, food to eat. But how do you escape from your skin color?
Yeah.
And that means that this is a classification that then is that you are burdened with forever. And if the critical race theory, identity politics, woke types were ever to come to absolute power, it would be a slave society defined by who you are in terms of how you look.
Yeah, we also see the same thing applied to men are the bourgeoisie and women are the proletariat as well. All men are rapists and things like that. And they seem to go different ways with what's important to what countries do you think were more successful after the fall of communism and why, and what countries were less successful? I don't know how much you traveled, but I was recently in Armenia and Georgia, and there was a huge difference between Armenia and Georgia.
Yes.
Maybe the thing that stood out for me most is, as wonderful as the people in Armenia were, those buildings were so ugly.
Yeah. The Eastern Bloc countries, in general, have done the best, particularly Poland, Czech Republic, more or less Slovakia, certainly Hungary, even with the current president, and certainly the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. My belief is that this has been due to the fact that they had that cultural and historical and economic legacy and heritage of Western institutions, of degrees of individual freedom, degrees of private property, degrees of market societies, degrees of rule of law, uh, that could be the building block for them to do economically and socially in general a lot better. The further east you go, the further east you go, the less you have of that. I have traveled to both Armenia and the Republic of Georgia several times. When I was president of the Foundation for Economic Education that you mentioned, uh, we were periodically doing student seminars in former Soviet bloc countries, several times in the Czech Republic, 3 times in Georgia, twice in Armenia, once in Ukraine. Um, and, well, for example, when we were in Armenia, uh, we were taking an old military highway from Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, to Yerevan, the capital of Armenia. And so we're passing these sort of partly destroyed, abandoned, and ghost-like villages. And we were asking, well, what are these places? Oh, those are Azerbaijani villages that we conquered in these wars they've been having between the two of them. And I said, but some of them look like they're habitable, and some are damaged, others are not. I see a lot of Armenians who are sort of homeless or not doing too well. Why haven't they moved into these places that you conquered? Oh no, oh no. The ghosts of the Azeris reside there, and those evil spirits could eat at the soul of we Armenians. Okay, and then we're talking to the students. And more than once, I asked a group of Armenian students, what's your goal in life? To die killing Azerbaijanis. A totally tribal view of these things. I'm sure if we had been in Azerbaijan, there would have been the comparable on the other side of this. Yeah. So to the closer, both in history and literally geography, that former Soviet bloc countries were to Western Europe, and therefore more before the Second World War, more part of that tradition, the more successful in general, broadly brushstroke speaking, those societies have been in escaping from their socialist past.
Yeah. When I was in Armenia in August, I did not see a single Ukrainian flag. Of course, in Georgia, they were everywhere. I mean,
well, you see, this is because the Armenians have viewed the Russians as their guarantors and protectors from the Azerbaijanis
and the Turks.
Yeah. Even though the Russians play nice with the Azerbaijanis as well. So the Russians play their own imperialist game, playing one side against the other. But the Armenians are sandwiched between the Azerbaijanis to the east and the Turks to the west. And the Turks, of course, are the historical enemy, since the Turks had killed several millions of them during the First World War. So they're far more tolerant of the Russians, whereas the Georgians have themselves been invaded by Putin's Russia and lost territory to Putin's Russia, and therefore are angrily opposed to virtually anything he tries to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I visited the Genocide Museum in Armenia. It was very interesting to see all the various dignitaries who had bought a tree there. You can buy a tree, like people like Putin had bought a tree. America's Texas Congressman Lloyd Doggett had bought a tree. Yeah, it was people all over the political spectrum had bought a tree. It was very interesting to see who just wanted to recognize, hey, this was a genocide. I mean, anyway. So. What do you think has happened to Russia? And you have a Russian wife. Maybe I should have had her on here. I mean, where did Russia go wrong? Where did what did America do wrong, if anything? I mean, why are we back to a Cold War?
You can make a strong case that the policies of the United States and the European members of NATO exacerbated a tense situation to begin with. Informally, the United States and the other NATO countries had promised in the 1990s that there would be no extension of NATO membership to former Soviet bloc countries. But it's reached the point where virtually all Eastern Bloc countries are now part of NATO. And it is clear that the CIA was attempting to undermine those in the Ukrainian government in the last 10 years or so who were sympathetic towards Putin and to try to get rid of them and install, quote, Western-friendly countries. This does not, in my opinion, justify Putin invading the country, but they exacerbated a paranoia. Those NATO policies exacerbated a Russian paranoia of encirclement and threat. And that has reinforced a certain mentality in Russia as it looks historically at the rest of the world, particularly from the West, that has played into both Putin's own fears and mindset and own agenda to justify reestablishing a Russian political and military sphere of influence in that part of the world. It's the case that Putin said several years ago that the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. He dreams of the Russian Empire restored from its Soviet recent past. And Western policies played into his plans and Russian mentality fears. But more importantly is that so how did Putin get to where he is? Well,
yeah,
it has to do with what happened in the 1990s. And basically that was the fact that when the Soviet Union ended formally in December of 1991, the constituent republics all became independent countries. That's how Ukraine is independent, the Baltic republics, Belarus, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, the Central Asian republics, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzia, Turkmenistan. But the problem is that the immediate post-Soviet period was one in which the Soviet elite basically manipulated their new political space and bought up the state. Most of what were the major state properties ended up being, quote, privatized into the hands of what was known in the Soviet period as the nomenklatura. Those were the members of the Soviet Party or the supervisorial members of the Central Planning Network who had the position, the leverage, and the inside opportunity to buy up state enterprises, buy up resources and mineral rights that the state was selling in various ways that created many of these oligarchs. The system was corrupt. The system was very unstable because in the immediate post-Soviet period, they undertook a massive price inflation with huge quantities of monetary expansion that decimated people who were already on shaky ground. Yeltsin ended up being a drunkard as the president of the new independent Russia. People were tired of him, tired of the corruption, tired of the economic instability. And so then at the end of the 1990s, when it was clear that he was going to have to go through sort of a labyrinth of Kremlin intrigue, he ended up appointing Putin as his successor. And putting Putin into power ended up being placing at the head of the state someone whose vision was still greatly influenced by his KGB past. He was a KGB agent stationed in Eastern Europe. and who came to have an ideological outlook of rebuilding a new Russia. To use a somewhat catchy phrase, make Russia great again. Make Russia great again.
Yeah.
Um, with a highly authoritarian mentality and a willingness to to feed the corruption and harness the corruption to reinforce and solidify his own power. Um, and and given that I said, the psychology of Russians, to put up with a lot and accept with a degree of fatalism uh, what their future course will be as dictated by hopefully a good czar rather than a bad czar. All of these things have led to the current position.
Yeah, yeah. I sometimes hear this theory that Russia sees themselves as the third incarnation of Rome. The first Roman Empire was the Roman Empire. The Byzantium was the second, and then Russia sees themselves as the third. And of course, and you're probably aware of Alexander Dugin. I mean, does he have a lot of influence on all this thinking too?
Well, he's written on it, but it's a huge debate among Kremlinologists. They used to have the Kremlinologists in the Soviet period, trying to read the tea leaves of what goes on in the higher echelons of the Soviet leadership inside the Kremlin. But there's sort of a Kremlinology now because of Putin's, ultra narrow secretness. Now, whether Dugin actually has met Putin, if he has, how many times, and what particular influence Dugin has had on Putin, all of these are speculative. But it's clear that whether there is that immediate connection between them or not, Putin accepts most of this worldview that Russia has a destiny based upon its history of being a pure spiritual country, free from the decadence and materialism of the West. That its tradition is not democracy, which is just the breeding ground of destabilizing corruption and centrifugal forces that would undermine the unity of the state with its vast territory and numerous ethnic groups. And that Russia has to have a higher standard of morality and political vision and purpose that requires a unification of power, not for power's sake, but for the destiny of the country by a leader who has the right purpose and vision in mind. And it may all be a rationalization in his own mind, but it's clear to me from his words that Putin believes himself as destined for greatness, to restore Russia and make Russia great again, and that will be his legacy. And that was part of the motive for him to invade Ukraine, because for him the Ukrainians aren't a real people; they're like little Russians, and they're all part of what needs to be a restored Russian Empire.
Yeah, some of the more conservative thinkers though think that the so-called values now of when these people in America say democracy, what they really mean is boys going into girls' locker rooms and girls going into boys' locker rooms. I mean, how much do you think that kind of thing influences Putin's thinking when he just sees our divorce culture and sees unstable marriages and most of Europe, they have 1.5 kids or even less?
Well, of course, Putin has his own broken marriage, and supposedly had taken up with this young gymnast and may have had children with her. Who knows? And he has 2 daughters, one of whom has spent a lot of time living in the West. But it's clear from the rhetoric that comes out of him, particularly for quite a while, but particularly since this invasion of Ukraine and his anger that the West has through its military support for Ukraine, has prevented his plan for easy and quick victory. Talks about the decadence of the West, that Western democracy means transgender changes and an undermining of the traditional values and structure of the society. So yes, he views that Western democracy means deciding which bathroom to go in every 27 minutes.
Yeah. Getting back to that note, what what do you think can be done with American academia? I mean, you've been at Hillsdale, which obviously has a reputation for being very free market, very conservative. You're at a military school now, which I'm going to assume is more on that level. Is Harvard ever going to be a haven for free market economics, or is it going to continue to be a communist cesspool?
I don't think that in the long run we can hope for any change in the intellectual and ideological climate of institutions of higher learning in the US, other than through the separation of state and education, state and schooling. For as long as from kindergarten through the PhD, uh, administrators and large swaths of the academic community at these places can rely upon compulsory taxation to assure them salaries and tenured positions, I don't think we're going to see much of a change. You have to realize that education, except for the portion of private schooling below high school and below, and the smaller handful of non-state universities, we live under educational socialism. Government owns the schools. Government hires the workers, and their state employees. The government at various levels, and depending upon the state rules of these things, sets the curriculum. The battle with Board of Educations at state and local levels is all about either my group determines the curriculum or theirs because it's a monopoly government agency. And that is the case with state universities. Now, and the problem is that with private universities, they too have become such feeders at the trough of government money, grants, scholarships, research funding, that for all intents and purposes, even nominally state universities are merely appendages to the direct state system. So until there is this separation of state and education, state and schooling, so that they cannot be guaranteed this, because how many parents would really want to send their child to a school and to major in lesbian studies, or to have a minor in identity politics, or to have their kid come home for holidays and listen to them gibber out with all of this leftist collectivist nonsense on economics or politics. Many of these institutions could not survive in terms of attracting private tuition money or endowment money as the basis of their financial existence by continuing with this nonsense. Some might, but the vast majority would slowly but surely drift away from it, or certainly it wouldn't be as dominant as it is now. But until there is that freeing of government education through the PhD, from feeding at the trough of taxpayer money, it will be very difficult to bring about a change.
Sure. So, what do you think the prospects are right now? I mean, especially after the last, the insanity of the last 2.5 years. We saw communism come here for the first, or saw the closest thing to communism come here.
Well, the U.S. has been drifting in this direction for a very long time. This didn't happen overnight. It started the progressive movement before the First World War. You had many academics, economists, political scientists, historians, sociologists, philosophers, who in the late decades of the 19th century, the 1880s, the 1890s, the first decade of the 20th century, had all gone to study in Europe for their capstone PhDs. And a large number were drawn to Imperial Germany, where they sat at the foot of what we'll call the members of the German Historical School, who all said that capitalism was crass, exploitive, but we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, we don't want to go full hog with the socialists and the Marxists who want to have revolution. So what we need is to have a highly regulatory, redistributive, paternalistic state. And in fact, it was in Imperial Germany that all the institutions of the modern welfare state emerged: Social Security, government health care, government housing, and so on. And these American young academics learned of this and saw what was going on in Imperial Germany and came back to America and Great Britain and said, listen, this is the new freedom. This is the new freedom. And in fact, the phrase, the government will take care of you from the cradle to the grave, that was from Imperial Germany that Americans brought back. That was the phrase there. And Americans would write books about this, that it's not that Germany, it's not that Germany doesn't have freedom compared to freedom in America. The Germans have a different kind of freedom where the government guarantees you all the necessities of life and overcomes the fears and the financial concerns of life. This is a higher freedom that only can come through the paternalism of the regulatory redistributive state. So it began there, and then it snowballed, obviously, during the 1930s with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal administration. But it continued ever since, through the post-war period, regardless of whether a Republican was in the White House or a Democrat, whether the Republicans or the Democrats controlled all or part of the Congress. It is just fed on itself. So the degree to which we now have a situation in which we have a $31 trillion debt, at a minimum $1 trillion annual budget deficits, a regulatory state that it's estimated costs the private sector $2 trillion a year in regulatory compliance costs, in which barely anything can occur in any commercial enterprise, business, or entrepreneurial activity without passing through endless hoops of government regulations, standards, prohibitions, mandates, all of which cost money, and then the vast redistribution. I mean, it's often estimated that if out of the entire U.S. population, almost 50% receive some form of government redistributive money. Maybe lesser, it may be more, it might be fully, it might be partially in terms of an income, but almost half the population feeds in one form or another from the trough of the state. That creates a huge spider's web of special interest groups, each of whom has an incentive to be in a coalition with the others to see that the trough is never emptied and taken away.
What can free market advocates do? Because it seems like we've not really. I mean, we just kind of our movement hasn't really went anywhere. I mean, and I think I think partially because a lot of people who weren't really our friends. I mean, I think one of the most evil people in the 20th century was William F. Buckley. I mean, because there was a lot of appeasement, but then you had the sincere free marketers who've never really had any traction anywhere, it seems.
Well, I think that a good part of it is that in the immediate political arena, I mean, there's been a sizable number of intellectuals or even academics who have been advocates of liberty. I'm thinking of like a Milton Friedman, a Friedrich Hayek, a Ludwig von Mises, a Thomas Sowell, a Walter Williams, and or in the journalism sphere, Henry Hazlitt, when he was alive, writing for decades and reaching huge audiences. But in the immediate political arena, it increasingly became the case as the post-World War II decades passed, that those often identified in the Republican Party as conservatives or limited government constitutionalists increasingly became frightened, afraid of even making the case for stopping this growth, or even more radically calling for its rollback in one form or another, with the fatalistic fear that it is an unwinnable political position. If you call for the end of Social Security or the privatization of Social Security, if you call for the separation of schooling or allow a greater latitude of non-government regulated private education, uh, if you call for deregulation, and reducing government interventions, that the American people will not accept this, because they've gotten so used to listening to the rhetoric of the Democrats and the left, that you'll be tarred and feathered as an enemy of the people, callous, heartless, uh, an agent of capitalist interests who just want to be freed from these benevolent government regulations so they can further harass and harm the consumers and the workers. Uh, and therefore, it's an unwinnable position to make the principled case for liberty in any election cycle. But that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if you say that I can't make the case for freedom, because if I make the case for freedom, I will lose. And so therefore I will moderate my position, or basically not talk about any end game of a free society, and hope that when I get elected, I can try to do things from the inside. Well, then you become a captive of the system. And every election cycle becomes the next cycle where, well, next time, to the extent that I still even think in those vision terms, I will try to do something. But if I'm in the House, I have an election coming up in 2 years again, a Senate 6 years, the president 2 years, and then local offices, obviously. And so as a consequence, your horizon becomes no further than the next election cycle, since you're focused on either getting elected or reelected. And therefore, the wider horizon of a free society, free of all these things, becomes lost in a fog that obscures even the idea of having a principled position on anything.
Does it sometimes seem maybe that the only issue that the Republicans ever really cared about was spending lots and lots of money on the military?
Yes, because you see, just as the Democrats have their coalition of special interest groups that on election day they hope will form a majority for them to get elected, the Republicans have this too. And a lot of Republicans have these coalitions of industries and companies connected with the defense manufacturing sectors. And a lot of these companies live practically totally off the money they get from government defense contracts. So you have an extremely strong set of vested interests who have motives to get politicians, not only in the Republican Party, because the Democrats have a lot of these military bases and factories in their states as well, but the Republicans have that. And then there's also the fact that the Republicans, again from a classic liberal or libertarian perspective, are unbelievably weak on civil liberties. Yes, we need to have a limited government in which individuals have individual freedom, but not to read what they want, not to smoke what they want, not what to drink what they want, not to have sex in any with other people that we don't think they should have sex with, and maybe we should determine what position they use as well. I mean, they're dominated by a fear of social freedom. Many of them are, and so that locks that door away to make the case for liberty. Of course, I could do the same thing about the Democrats. They can't imagine people living their own lives. No, you're too ignorant to make your own decisions about your retirement. You're too ignorant to make your own decisions about healthcare. No, you're too ignorant to make your decisions about the education of your child. No, you're too ignorant and easily abused to make your own contract for work with an employer. We have to support labor unions. We have to have minimum wage laws. We have to have this. We have to guarantee public housing. We have to do this. That. I mean, it's just different variations on the collectivist theme that the two parties highlight and emphasize. I occasionally here in the Charleston area go to a Republican monthly luncheon event. And more than once, when it's been an election cycle and you've had Republicans speaking at the luncheon event, oh, please support me, blah, blah, blah. There's always a Q&A session. And so I've gotten up and I've said, well, I understand that there's limited time, but I would wish each of you to maybe just take a minute and a half to outline, given that all of you have said the government is too big, government spends too much, government is taxing too much. I would like each of you to take maybe just a minute and a half and briefly outline what state or local programs you think could be reduced or abolished to get us back in a limited government direction. Dead silence. Or as a friend of mine said, you can hear the crickets chirp. Dead silence. Yes, government is too big, government regulates too much, government taxes too highly, but silence, once it becomes a request to mention concrete programs that you would have to tell voting groups you're going to take away from them.
Yeah, it is a tough question. Is how do you get out of this mess? And it seems like to me the only way to get out of the mess is to have, unfortunately, something really horrible happen. I mean,
well, there was an economist named Mansur Olson, and he once wrote a book. It was back in the 1990s called "The Decline and Fall of Nations." He's a free market guy, and he basically said that from his studies, the only way to break the closely knit spider's web of the corrupt interventionist welfare state is a great cataclysm that loosens everything up. A hyperinflation, a destructive war. You can shake up Germany in the post-World War II period because they were defeated and their societies were destroyed, and the preceding system had been thrown totally into disrepute. The fact is, one of the reasons why you've never seen, part of the reason we haven't seen Russia move in a freedom direction, they didn't lose the Cold War in the sense of like you lost early, you were conquered, you were made to face your crimes, like the Nazis had, the Germans had to face what happened in the concentration camps and all the other business. So they've never had to face that, and so they just plod along in their collectivist direction. But one would hope that you would. Let's suppose that that's true. That Mansur Olson was right about this. There has to be some major social upheaval to loosen up the spider's web of interest groups. Well, but how do you know it's going to move in your direction? And you see, that's why it's important for Friends of Freedom today to be making the case for liberty and arguing its practical workability, both from our experiences in the past, as well as imaginings of how the market and free choice and voluntary association could replace many of the things that government does today. So that when we come to such a crossroads, well, are we going to move there? We're in a social and economic and political crisis. Are we going to move further down some new variation of the collectivist road? Or are we going to follow a direction that takes us to a more classical, liberal, libertarian, free society? We can't influence which direction at that crossroads society takes unless we have been successful in influencing the terms of the debate and influencing the climate of opinion so that at the time when the choice has to be made, they move in a freedom direction and not in a collectivist direction. So even no matter how much we despair, it's important not to lose confidence and belief in the ideas of liberty and to keep fighting for them, because a day will come when it will be important to have influenced public opinion so the right political choice, which direction at the crossroads we actually take.
You know, really, the one thing that probably gives me hope right now more than anything is Bitcoin. What do you think about Bitcoin?
Well, this is another long conversation, which unfortunately time is not going to permit.
Yeah.
But it is as important to separate money from the state as it is such things as education from the state. As long as government has the means and the methods, either directly or through some appointed agency, a central bank, to create as much money as it needs to fund its expenses, the real resources of the society and the taxpayers are at the mercy of those in political power and the dangers of inflations, the business cycle, recessions, and then the renewal of the cycle. So it is as important to free money from the state as it is these other things like education.
Certainly, yeah. So it certainly seems like there's a. Do you have any other great stories to tell, or?
Well, unfortunately,
Yeah. Yeah. We don't really have much time left. So yeah.
but 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 maybe you could be kind and generous enough to have me on us another time.
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah. I mean,
That-
you went to a fee seminar, I think in 1974. I mean, you've met all these people that I never got to meet. I mean,
And there are
yeah.
some of your listeners might be familiar with the famous Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises.
Oh, yes.
And I and my wife actually found his lost papers in Moscow,
Yes, of course. I knew about that. Yeah.
plundered, and
Yeah.
the Soviets had captured. And
Yeah.
we could perhaps talk about that and the importance of the ideas of the Austrian school
Yeah.
to
And
preserve
just, yeah.
society.
And just some of those great people at fee I got to meet. I'm real, if I'd gotten involved a little sooner, maybe I'd have gotten a chance to meet Hayek, Hazlitt, and because Hayek, Hazlitt, Mrs. von Mises, and Karl Hess all died within about 2 years,
Mhm.
and they were all really great people. But yeah, so you have anything else you want to say before we go, or
That's it. I just want to thank you so much for having me
yeah,
on. Enjoyed the conversation.
yeah,
Give a plug. There's a book right there on the shelf behind me called For a New Liberalism.
yes,
That came out not too long ago, where I make the case for a restored classical liberalism of individual liberty, free markets, private property, rule of law, and constitutionally limited government. And
yeah.
I things in terms of the issues of the day, the historical importance of liberty.
I love the word liberalism, and I always will, but we're never going to go anywhere as long as we use the word classical. I mean, classical people think old, irrelevant. I mean, maybe future liberalism or new liberalism, or I don't know, or cutting edge liberalism. But
Well, I don't know why. I was glad
yeah,
when they went to classic Coke.
yeah, yeah, that was one thing that did work. But but anyway, I hope we can say how that works out. Or maybe I don't know. Maybe we'll just come up with a new word. Of course, LIBR liberalism, LIBR liberty. So I will never call the people on the left nowadays liberals. But okay, well, thank you very much, and have a good day.
It's been
Bye
my
bye.
pleasure. Thank you again.
Bye bye.